This is the ThieAudio Origin. It is an $850 icon of bass in IEMs, and everyone is asking me to review this. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and if you know anything about me, you probably know that I am not really a big bass head. In fact, I first heard the Origin back at CanJam in September of last year, and I was not that impressed. It's definitely not the IEM for me, or at least that was my impression. But enough people kept asking me about it that I got curious, and I'm glad that I did. So before we get into this, a quick shout out to Duckbloke. He's a fellow IEM reviewer. I'll link his YouTube channel in the description down below. He loaned me his Origin, and for the past couple of weeks, I've been listening to this thing, living with it, and comparing it with some other IEMs kind of similar. Although, as we'll get into, this thing is pretty unique at its price range, because what we've got here is $850, like I mentioned. Let me look at the driver configuration. It's got one dynamic driver, 4 balanced armatures, 2 electrostat drivers, as well as 1 bone conduction driver. And I know that like 2024 was kind of a breakout year for bone conduction drivers. They existed before that, but it felt like a lot of the IEMs that were getting kind of this underground hype were IEMs that were sporting bone conductor drivers. And here's what I'm going to say about these. I can't tell you what the bone conductor driver is doing in this IEM. I can tell you, however, about the final result, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to dive to the table. I don't have the packaging stuff because it's just a loaner unit, but I will describe physical form factor, fit and comfort, and all that jazz before we get into talking about the sound, and then I'll bring in another IEM for comparison before we wrap this thing up with a conclusion. But let us start with the physical form factor, and let's start with just describing this cable. A lot, actually, surprisingly, has been said about the cable that this IEM comes on, and I think for good reason, because it's not the typical cable that you would expect with a high-end IEM. It's a little bit on the stiff side. You can see it's, I don't want to say it's memory prone because it will work itself out, but it is definitely a stiff, thick, kind of a chonky cable. And I kind of agree with a lot of people that I think it actually works pretty well on this IEM. Again, like the behavior on it is not the best. It is not the most pliable, softest cable. And in some ways it's a little bit annoying, but the IEM itself is a pretty chonky boy. We're going to get into describing that. And it just feels like a pretty good match for it. However, I do have one pretty serious beef with this cable. And it's this termination down here. No, it's not that it's 4.4. Okay, yes, I complain about that all the time. But this is a swappable termination. So you can make this a 3.5 mil single-headed termination if you want. And the mechanism to do so is really quite easy. You just pull this thing out, plug on the other termination, and there you go. However, I really dislike this mechanism for 2 reasons. 1, this is pretty long. But 2, this doesn't lock into place in any way. In fact, I find that the 4.4 mil connector here is a stronger connection than this connection is. So a lot of the times I'll plug this thing into my DAP and then I'll try to pull this cable out and this thing pops out rather than the 4.4 mil connection. Of course, you can remedy that by just remembering to grab up here, but it is nonetheless an annoyance and something that I don't really like about this cable. Apart from that, let's see, we've got a chin cinch, we've got a chin slider that, you know, it's useful. It stays in place while you're wearing it, but as you can see, it is a little bit loose and prone to sliding around and repositioning itself. And then of course you've got your preformed ear hooks as well as fairly standard 2-pin connector. The connection here is slightly recessed, but that's very mild recess. So this IEM should be compatible with pretty much any 2-pin connector you've got out there. But yeah, just to kind of show how all that works. Now I guess we can talk about the earpieces themselves, and I guess I'm just going to start with the aesthetics on this IEM, which are a little bit of, I don't know, they're kind of a mixed bag for me. I feel like all of ThieAudio's IEMs from the last year or so are just kind of got random patterns on the outside. They don't feel particularly iconic or like memorable. I have a feeling in a couple of years we're going to look back at the last year of ThieAudio IEMs, and if you haven't owned one of them, they're all going to look the same, or they're all going to kind of blend together, and you're not going to know which one you're looking at because they just have random patterns. Now, this is, you know, a random pattern that is slightly different than the random pattern you got on something like the Hype 10 or the Monarch Mark III, but nonetheless, I don't know. It's a little bit meh for me. As well executed as I guess it is. The rest of the IEM, however, let's talk about this because the shell is semi-transparent. As you can see here, I believe this is the bone conduction driver that is positioned here at the back of the shell, and it's positioned so far back in the shell that you can start to see it shine through the semi-transparent shell, but the rest of it is pretty much so dark that you're not going to be able to see the drivers inside of it, which a little bit of a missed opportunity. I do like it when the shell or the resin is a little bit transparent and you can see inside there. Maybe if I shined a light in there, I'd be able to see a little bit more, but as it is, it's mostly just a solid black design. The nozzle on this thing is not particularly long. However, the entire IM itself is a chonky MF, and that's kind of true. This is another thing that's kind of true of ThieAudio IMs, especially like their high-end stuff where they're packing a lot of drivers in them. They're just not really that concerned about making an earpiece that is really, really large, and probably too large for a lot of people out there. Just to kind of put this into context, I'm going to bring in the Moondrop Critical Dusk. This is an IM that is known for being fairly large. I would describe this as like a medium-large size, but it's an IM that a lot of people have an issue wearing. But you can see up against the Origin here, well, the Origin is just kind of dwarfing the Dusk. The Dusk looks like it's about 30% smaller in most dimensions, and that really is, at least for my ear, it means that the Origin just doesn't really fit very well. And I guess as we're talking about that, I will give you a demonstration of this IM in my ear. Hold on while I untangle this cord. But there you go. There is the Origin in my ear. I would say this is very squarely a large fitting IM, and also partly because of it being large. Maybe it's the ear tip I've got on it. Maybe if I rolled the ear tips, I could get a little bit better of a fit. But really, like, this back half of the IM is not even really touching the inside of my ear. It's pretty much the only contact point is at my ear canal with the ear tip. And that's been true with the ThieAudio Monarch 2, actually the original Monarch as well, the Monarch Mark II, as well as the Monarch Mark III, and here again with the Origin. So I don't want to say it's the exact same shape and size as the Monarch Mark II, because it's definitely not. In fact, I would say this one maybe fits me a little bit better than the Monarch Mark II, but just barely. It's generally not a very good fitting IM, in my opinion. Now, of course, fit is a very particular, very personal thing. It might actually fit your ear perfectly fine, but hopefully I've given you enough context with some other IMs to be able to predict with some certainty whether or not this is likely to fit in your ear, because I would say if you're unclear, there's a good chance this won't fit you very well. But I think that's about as much as we can talk about the physical form factor on this IM. So we are going to get into talking about the sound on it. And to do that, we're going to start with the frequency response graph, which is available on Squiggly if you want to check this out for yourself. Linked in the description down below, but let's do a little bit of analysis together here. As promised, this is very much a bass forward IM, okay? This thing has got gobs of bass, right? You can see that my neutral target is down here in this thicker dotted line. The Harman target is this thinner dotted line, which has got a fairly hefty bass boost to it. And then you can see that the Origin is still an extra 5 dB of bass above that. Plus, it's not lean in the mid bass. Like, this is just a bassy boy. But if you ignore the bass boost and you look at this just kind of from the top up, it actually looks pretty nicely tuned. This is following, very much in line with my neutral target. There is a little bit of excess kind of mid treble here, which we'll talk about in a little bit what that does to the sound signature, but generally pretty well balanced upper treble. A lot of the ThieAudio stuff has kind of exaggerated upper treble, and I think that the Origin here is actually pretty well balanced. You could even almost describe this as new meta in terms of its tuning profile, apart from this little bit of excess treble here, which is not insignificant. But yeah, that's kind of the frequency response and what to expect of the sound on this IM. But what does it sound like to my ear? What are kind of my subjective impressions? And we're going to start with that bass, okay? Because it's hard to ignore that bass. And in fact, the bass is part of why, when I first heard this thing in September, I did not really like it that much. It is too much bass. It is dominant bass. It is overbearing bass. It's droning. You could even define or even describe it as like ill-defined bass, right? And this is the thing I talk about a lot of the times when I talk about not being a fan of a lot of bass. It's not because I don't like bass. It's because I like bass to be like tight and punchy, and like I like to be able to follow the sub-bass notes and the shifts and the definition. Like, these are the things that I like about bass. And when you add gobs of bass to an IM like you got here with the Origin, you lose a lot of that, right? You get, yes, you do get this thick, warm sound signature, but in my opinion, it comes at the expense of the technical performance of the bass. But nonetheless, the more I listen to this IM, the way that the bass is executed actually becomes kind of interesting, okay? It actually becomes almost this other thing, all right? Or I described why I like bass. The bass on this thing, I wrote this phrase, like it almost hits like escape velocity, and it like exits the realm of muddying up the rest of the sound signature, and it kind of becomes its own atmospheric element of the music. It's like this diffuse atmospheric sound. It's almost like gooey in the bass, and it's almost like in the way that people like describe tube amplifiers on their headphones. It almost gives it like this ooey gooey sound that, again, like it gets to the point where it's not really muddying up the rest of the frequency response. Like it doesn't have this closed in overcrowdedness to the bass. Like the bass just becomes this diffuse character of the sound that's actually kind of unique. And I like that. Now, as for the rest of the sound I think is actually pretty well done here on the Origin. The frequency response is quite nice. Tuning, like naturalness, tonality sounds fantastic. That little bit of extra treble that I highlighted in the kind of mid-treble region, I'm interpreting that by listening as giving it a little bit of contrast. I think that's probably helping it break out of, you know, that muddiness. Transients are actually really well defined on this. Guitar like plucks and stuff like that have a really nice bite to them without being overly sharp or anything like that. I do find that it does come at the expense of vocals becoming a little bit on the edgy side. Some vocals can be a little bit sibilant. Church's Graffiti is a track I use a lot of the times. Even like the Parcels live album can come across a little bit on the sibilant side, a little bit edgy here and this. And I think that's just kind of like, that's just the price of having that much bass plus still having actually pretty nice definition throughout the rest of the frequency response. It just comes across a little bit on the edgy side. But overall, like what you get is just this sound that is, I can't really describe it any other way than just grand. Like it's a wide, big, impressive sound field that maybe isn't going to work with all music, but actually with live music in particular. So I mentioned the Parcels live album, even better with Alice in Chains Unplugged album. This set really is just kind of impressive. It's clearly dominated by the bass, but in a way that is kind of nice, and I dig it. Now, for comparison, I don't have a whole lot of IMs that compete with this on bass, but I have actually recently reviewed this one, which is the Mega 5 EST Bass Plus Edition. Frequency response wise, they actually align quite a bit. And so this actually, I think, makes it an interesting comparison. Now, price-wise, this is quite a bit cheaper. I believe this is $590 versus $850. This is using a slightly different driver configuration. It doesn't have the bone conduction driver. And again, like I don't really get into driver memes and like reading too much into what the driver configuration is. I think it's interesting, but I don't really find a whole lot of predictive value in it. So let's talk about how these things actually sound to my ear. And again, I think the tonality in these things is actually kind of similar, because while the Megafest is kind of, again, the grandfather of this more modern tonality that's, you know, warm in the lower mids and like a little bit reined in the upper mid-range, just really well balanced mid-range tuning, plus gobs of bass. That's kind of similar to what we've got over here on the Origin. The big difference is that you're not going to get that lower treble or sort of that mid-treble bite that you get here on the Origin. And I think that makes this just overall less interesting to listen to. I find that the Megabass, with its excessive bass boost, just overall more sludgy, less separated in its sound signature, whereas the Origin does a really good job of still maintaining that nice separation and, you know, a good bite on those transients. The Megafest or the Megafest Bass Plus specifically, is fine in those regards, but it's clearly impaired by the added bass that you get it here in this version. In my mind, the Megafest Plus bass is, or the Megabass, let's just call it the Megabass, is, I don't know, it's less interesting to me. It is Megafest Plus bass, but it feels like it doesn't have its own identity. It's just kind of fine. Whereas the Origin does stand out as something that is uniquely interesting. The one thing I would say in the advantage to the Megabass is that it is less edgy because of that lack of treble. I think it does better with sibilants. It's just overall is a less engaging IM. But I think that is going to do it for my thoughts here on the ThieAudio Origin. Score-wise, this one's actually a little bit difficult for me. I'm going to end up giving it 3 stars out of 5. I think that the sound is actually pretty interesting. While tonally, this is absolutely not what I'm normally looking for. I'm not looking for a bass icon, all right? But it does it in such a way that it becomes kind of its own thing. And again, it's not the best bass quality, I don't think, but it gives it this nice ooey gooey atmospheric sound that I find kind of alluring. Honestly, if this thing fit me better, I might be tempted to get one, but as it is, it just doesn't fit that well, and that's why I'm pretty confident with the 3 stars out of 5. However, if you want to check it out for yourself, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, also linked in the description, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit.